Okay, well, welcome back, everybody. I'll just keep it very brief. But it's a great honor and a great pleasure to introduce my very good friend Jeff Kripal, whom I think most of you will know at least by name. What can I say about Jeff? Jeff is a phenomenon. That means he's sui generis. There's no one else like him. Sort of like I'm almost tempted to say something like a flying saucer that appears somewhere. But okay. Jeff is a scholar of religion, professor of study of religion at Rice University in Houston in the United States. He is an Indologist by training originally, came from the University of Chicago. Wrote a very interesting and a very controversial book about Ramakrishna, Kali's child, which caused a lot of controversy because he interpreted Ramakrishna from the perspective of he basically argued that there was a homoerotic narrative, if I formulate it correctly, that was essential to understanding Ramakrishna. That caused enormous controversy. After that, Jeff has moved into new directions as a scholar of religion. He's gotten very interested in the history and the practice and the whole another phenomenon of Esalen at the American West Coast, the Center for the Human Potential Movement. He's now also a director, I hope I say it right, of the Center of Theory and Research, right, at Esalen Institute. That's where we met in the whole series of conferences that we organize also together on Western Esotericism at Esalen. Jeff has written one of the most important books, if not the most important book, about Esalen and the religion of no religion, as he calls it. From there on, he has kept developing his thinking, and for me, the experience was always like, every time Jeff comes up with something new, I think, oh my God, Jeff, what are you doing now? And then I confess sometimes I'm initially a bit skeptic. I think, what, the paranormal in the study of religion, I don't know. UFOs in the study of religion, I don't know. Superhero comics, study of religion, I don't know. But then every time I read a book and I think, oh, all right, okay. And it changes my mind and it changes my thinking, and that has happened. So Jeff has basically changed my mind and changed my perspective several times now, and I have no doubt that he will keep doing that. That is basically what I wanted to say about Jeff. So his latest book is called The Flip. That's the topic of his present lecture. Yeah, well, another way of saying is that Jeff has flipped me several times, and he's about to flip you now. So I very much like to give the floor to Jeff, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Wouter. That was very sweet. And thank you, Kevin, for inviting me here. It's an honor, it's a pleasure. I have to say I feel very square in this audience. So, my talk today is really about how esoteric ideas and structures are reproduced in the sciences. And this talk was originally delivered to a group of physicists and philosophers of mind. And so I do I hope a lot of work in it. The kinds of things that Jenny was talking about earlier and Wouter was addressing in this conversation we just had. How do you make academics, and in this case scientists, comfortable with these sorts of ideas and even these sorts of practices? And I think there are ways to do that. I think a lot of intellectuals, frankly, are in the closet. They're deeply supportive, but they're looking for ways not to sound like the tabloids, basically. And I think this was the source of Wouter's I don't know about that. So that's kind of what I do. I try to take really strange things and make them comfortable to professional intellectuals, and that's what I do here. I also am very aware I'm the only thing standing between you and dinner. and that we're probably all very tired and a bit hungry. So I got some pretty pictures you can look at if you lose what I'm saying. Okay, I'm going to start out with a story that I'll return to many times in the talk, and it goes like this. A man named John Morgan wrote me after reading The Flip, which is the book Wouter just mentioned. A flip is a life-changing moment, often catalyzed by trauma or some other extreme event in which a person enters an altered state of consciousness and subsequently reverses or flips his or her metaphysical perspective. Once holding to a strong materialist position in which consciousness is understood to be an evolutionary accident or a purely local epiphenomenon of brain processes, the flipped individual is now convinced that consciousness is a fundamental feature of the cosmos and not reducible to neurological or biological processes. Okay, so that's what I mean by a flip. Back to John Morgan. John is a professional copywriter in Los Angeles. His interest is an especially eloquent but fairly typical example of the kinds of letters I receive almost every week and have been receiving for about a decade now since I began writing and speaking in public about what I call the impossible. More on that in a moment. Here is John's flip in his own words. So now this is John. I lived in San Francisco. I was asleep one night in 2002 when I was awakened by the sound of a horrific car crash at the intersection. I heard the screech of brakes and then a violent crash. I bolted awake. My heart was pounding. My first thought was, go outside, get the victims help. I ran out of my house, but when I looked to the intersection, there was nothing. No smashed cars and no evidence of an accident, nor any cars at all. I was dumbfounded. It didn't feel like a dream. It was much more specific. What woke me up was a distinct experience of sound as opposed to something visual. My dreams are almost exclusively visual, so it didn't make sense this was a dream. Still, I put myself back to bed and told myself it was probably a dream, however unique it felt. The next day I went to work and followed my normal routine and went to bed around 11 p.m. Then in the middle of the night while I slept, I heard the exact same accident I heard the night before. The violent screech of brakes, the tremendous impact of metal versus metal. Again, I bolted up in bed. I distinctly remember being confused. Is this last night? Why is this repeating? What's going on? After a moment trying to process all this, I heard someone outside on the street shout something like, "Oh my God, somebody get help." At that point, I felt this wave of adrenaline rush through my body all at once. I realized this was in fact a different night than the previous one, and this time the accident was real. I ran outside and a car had been T-boned, rolled several times and landed in my neighbor's yard. I learned later that a young man in the car died. Later that night, I broached the subject with myself. Did I in fact have a precognition of the accident? A prosaic rationale would have been coincidence, but the odds of a searingly real dream of an accident coming the night before an actual accident seemed too great. I'd never dreamed of car accidents before, besides. Both of the crashes as I experienced them were exact. Same time of night, same location, same sounds. I didn't know what happened, but I knew it wasn't coincidence and was something supernatural or whatever it should be called. We could now proceed for the rest of my talk with story after story like John's. Indeed, this is the water in which I professionally swim or drown. But I won't tell you these stories. We don't have the time, and it is patently obvious after the last few days that you not only know many such stories, you are such stories. My goal, then, is to provide you with some thoughts in the hope that something here might provide you with a few clues or provocations about where we might want to go next with our work, about who we might want to be tomorrow. The perspective from which I speak is the history of religions. That is, the comparative study of extreme or exotic states of consciousness coded in cultural forms. Such cultural forms include the scriptural texts for sure, but they also include other coded forms of consciousness, including architecture, painting, sculpture, music, drama, poetry, fiction, science fiction, film, television, and today pop cultural expressions like superhero comic books. The history of religions, in this view anyway, is the history of art taken very, very seriously. That is, as a kind of cipher or revelation of the real. Here at least, religion is art that has forgotten that it is art. Or if you prefer, art is religion that has not yet become religion. Stories like John's can be approached in at least two different ways, one historical and descriptive, and one philosophical and normative. To think in a more granular fashion, I like to imagine two bars that we can attempt to jump over here. The first bar comes down to an admittedly, remember I'm speaking to physicists, you guys are probably over the fourth or fifth bar, but we're just going to imagine three here. The first bar comes down to an admittedly colloquial question. Do such things really happen? Or are they non-events, functions perhaps of miscalculated coincidences, meaningless statistical outliers, or neurological blips of the pattern-seeking brain? Put more technically, do such events take place in both the mental or subjective and the material or objective dimensions of the world, or are they only subjective illusions, mistakes of bad thinking, bad probability, projection, mental pathology, and so on? The same questions can be put in the terms of a much simpler one. Why do people believe impossible things? My own answer to the latter question goes something like this. People believe impossible things because impossible things happen to people. People around the world believe in a soul that is separable from the body because people around the world have experienced what look very much like their own souls or those of others separating from their bodies in all sorts of situations. People around the world believe in some form of reincarnation because small children routinely claim to remember in great detail their previous lives and report them to their parents and family, especially, it turns out, when their previous lives ended violently, suddenly, and unjustly. People around the world practice dream divination because people around the world occasionally dream of the future before it happens, exactly like John. What we think of as impossible is not impossible at all, it turns out. The impossible is simply a function of our own present physicalist belief systems, which declares all sorts of well-attested human potentials impossible because they are incompatible with that reigning system and its own jealous modes of knowing. Put a bit differently, our conclusions are a function of our exclusions. And we have excluded a lot. If we put back on the table much of what we have taken off the table over the last few hundred years, so that we could control the rules of the game and so manipulate and measure all the stuff that we allowed on the table, our conclusions will inevitably change. And so will we. Please note that the student of such religious phenomena does not need to believe any of the belief systems that build up around such extraordinary experiences to appreciate the utter reasonableness and power of such beliefs. To invoke another story documented in the literature, this one of a Swedish mother, if any of us had a disturbing dream the night before a school field trip that our young daughter would be left lying asleep on the train tracks in mortal danger, and exactly that played out the next day as we worried all day at home, most of us, I suspect all of us, would seriously entertain a belief in precognitive dreams whatever our earlier education or training told us. We would not need to believe in God or prayer or guardian angels. We would only need to accept the facts of our own troubling experience. It is really that simple. Belief as intellectual assent to some past creedal statement is perfectly irrelevant in such contexts. It is a simple matter of empiricism, honesty, and in this case, a mother's well-founded anxiety. The first bar is not too difficult to get over. All one really needs is a certain level of hermeneutical charity and sympathy, or a child. Once one is over the first bar, the second bar quickly appears. The second bar comes down to the question of origin or cause. Okay, if these things are a part of our mental material world, how exactly do they work? Are there physical mechanisms involved, or is the search for a material mechanism misplaced, and we should be looking instead for meaning and purpose? Such questions in turn lead naturally to another. Can such events tell us something important about ourselves, about subjectivity itself, about the nature of consciousness as such? Take John's experience again. If we accept that such an event happened in both his dream world the first night and outside his window the second night, and I do accept that, then such events may well point to something very profound about the location of consciousness in time. The event strongly suggests, after all, that consciousness, particularly when altered by the emotional gravity of nightmare and impending tragedy, may not be entirely located in what we call the present. The now of consciousness might be much more expansive than we imagine. We might not be the prisoners of space and time that we think. Which leads me to the third bar. The third bar asks, but if these impossible phenomena in fact take place in both the mental and material dimensions, that's the first bar, and suggest something about the nature and scope of subjectivity itself, that's the second bar, might they also sign or signal to us fundamental truths about the objective physical universe? Might such phenomena have something important to say about the behavior and structure of space, time, energy, and matter? Can we speak of a physics of mystics? Such questions admittedly grate against almost every assumption we make in the university these days, with our neat divisions between the subjective humanities and the objective sciences. All the more reason to listen to them. Take John's precognitive nightmare. It is hardly just a dream. It is also a Gedanken experiment, a thought experiment just begging to be thought. And once thought, it clearly implies something like the philosophical position of eternalism, or a block cosmology in which the future already exists, a future, moreover, to which we have some rare but real access. His precise precognitive hearing of something in the near future does not prove such a cosmology, of course, but it clearly acts as a very suggestive sign of the same. It goads us, teases us to explore in that particular direction. Easily one of the finest examples of a scholar attempting to get over all three bars is the scholar of religion, Paul Marshall. And Paul, by the way, happens to be sitting somewhere, so there he is. His recent The Shape of the Soul, What Mystical Experience Tells Us About Ourselves and Reality, is a model of what I am calling for here. Note the subtitle. There are all three bars, as clear as day. Marshall has serious training in the natural sciences at Cambridge, particularly physics, and is most interested in the fundamental structure of the physical universe. Technically put, that structure for him is an evolutionary monadology informed by the philosopher Leibniz, but revisioned now in the light of Einsteinian relativity, Darwin's natural selection, and a fuller evolutionary esotericism. Translated into more colloquial terms, Marshall argues that if the universe is spherical, then so too is the soul, given their fundamental unity, and that moreover, as such spherical beings, we are evolving spiritual intellectual monads profoundly connected to one another and to a much greater shared whole. Marshall is precise and philosophical. For him, these cosmic monads are also slowly evolving, inherently striving over countless biological lives within a single vast cosmic network of interrelated subjectivities or centers of experience, centers that represent one another and by so doing constitute the fundamental units of what we perceive as matter. Hence his integration of common parapsychological phenomena like telepathy and precognition, which for him are nothing more and nothing less than natural expressions of these interconnected monads that enjoy an all-inclusive perception and latent omniscience. Most significantly, and perhaps most simply, mind is fundamental. It is not a random product of biological evolution. It undergirds and presumably guides everything that is. But mind is also fundamentally social in structure. There is a community of beings or monads that all share an identity with the whole. So plurality and unity are both paradoxically central. Paul did not just think or study his way to these extraordinary conclusions, although he did a great deal of that as well. His thought is in deep conversation with modern science, particularly physics, but it is also grounded in a mystical experience that he underwent as a young man that he considers, quote, genuinely revelatory, unquote, and that he describes as an encounter with what he calls a superhuman dimension of self. The experience was a classical example of what I have called the humanist two. That is, the revelation that the socialized ego, historical persona, or religious identity is not all we are. Here is how Paul describes the result of his experience on his thinking on the very first page. So this is Paul now. It was now plain that a good deal of what I had taken myself to be was relatively unimportant and insubstantial, dependent on something far more alive and profound. That much more was of the nature of mind, intensely perceptual and knowing, holding the universe in its compass and disposed toward the most inclusive love. Yet it was not other than myself, and if true of me, then true of each and every one of us. I do not know if Marshall's vision of a hyper-connected network of spheres of consciousness approximates the final truth of things, or whether such a vision can be integrated into some larger unitary whole. His own thought seems to lead in this direction. I can certainly find much to support it in the history of religions, particularly in Jainism and Mahayana Buddhism, comparative resonances with which he is very familiar. But that is not my point at the moment. My point is that this is precisely the general direction I would hope we might move now. The employment of both historical and personal mystical states as generators of future philosophy of mind and scientific modeling. Okay, I was going to actually skip this section, but given our conversation about subjectivity and objectivity, I think I'm going to include it. It's 5 minutes long. What? Good, okay. The talk's only about 3 hours, so we're good. No, it'll be done soon. Okay, so if I don't know if Paul's right, what do I actually think? It's a fair question, and I do not want to dodge it. My most general intellectual wager is that the whole gleaned or intuited from comparative mystical literature strongly suggests that consciousness and the cosmos are two modes or expressions of the same fundamental reality, manifesting in us as knowing and experiencing subjects, but that there are many, probably countless ways of framing this gnosis. Most simply put, too simply put, the world is one, although it becomes two in our experiences when we split it up in our knowing and sensing. That is, when we become human subjects and are socialized into various reigning worldviews and identities and inhabit different bodies. We don't do this consciously or intentionally, much less as individuals. We do this by virtue of being born into a specific body, language, family, and community, and becoming socialized subjects who sense and know physical objects. That is, who split the world up into two basic dimensions of experience, the mental and the material, the subjective and the objective. In short, I lean strongly to some sort of monistic picture in a dual aspect mode. I have employed this ontology in my published work to understand what I call the impossible, basically paranormal phenomena, as a meaningful collapse of the subject-object structure, that is, as a temporary revelation of the one world that hums below its dualistic appearances. It is my opinion, my wager, that such paradoxical phenomena are anything but philosophical fluff or neurological blips. They are important signs pointing to a cosmos that is profoundly connected, that is one, however we want to imagine this unity. This partial or complete collapse of the subject-object structure, known partly and darkly in impossible events, and more fully and directly in mystical experiences, points to what I want to call the future of knowledge. I pretend no pure objectivity here. Indeed, for the philosophical reasons just stated, I would deny both the autonomy of a purely objective material realm and consequently the ideal of objectivity as such, as an adequate final stance. Objectivity is a half-truth. So is subjectivity. I speak just below or just above both, out of a clear conviction that the future of knowledge will come when we are able to see through both as temporary effects of our own existence as subjects perceiving an apparently objective world, and move out of this splitting into a more fundamental ground that preceded our own existence and will remain long after we, as little egos, are no more. The face we had before we were born, to invoke a Zen riddle. It is a curious fact. Modern science and technology have not somehow eliminated people's spiritual sensibilities. Quite the contrary, they have been wildly productive of new spiritual ideas and expressions. Think the near-death and psychedelic literatures, or the ever-increasing library on the philosophy of quantum physics. None of this would have happened, not like this anyway, without the advances of biomedical technology in the case of the near-death literature, modern chemistry in case of the psychedelic literature, and of course quantum physics in the case of the quantum mystical literature. Nor would have such modern mystical literatures appeared without the central role of the scientists themselves. The quantum philosophy literature, for example, was not born in the counterculture in the 1960s or by New Age enthusiasts in the 1980s, as is commonly claimed. It was born in the heart of quantum mechanics in founding figures like Niels Bohr, Wolfgang Pauli, and Erwin Schrödinger, each of whom saw profound correspondences, not identities, between physics and mystics. Such men had no trouble with the physics of mystics. Indeed, they actively promoted the comparison and the correspondences that made the comparison work. Allow me a single telling example. Erwin Schrödinger. Schrödinger, pictured here, was one of the pioneers of quantum mechanics. He thought deeply about the relationship between science and religion, hence his little book, What is Life, which came out in 1944. Most of the book involves a quite technical discussion of biology, chromosomes, and mutations as these were understood in the early 1940s. Then the epilogue drops in as if out of nowhere. It is clearly a kind of credo. Suddenly, Schrödinger just walks out of the metaphysical closet. Boringly entitled On Determinism and Free Will, the epilogue is anything but boring. In it, Schrödinger asserts that all forms of I are in actual fact, and despite deceptive appearances to the contrary, the exact same I. There is only one mind, which he capitalized, and it is this single self, again capital S, that in any act of volition or physical movement controls the motion of the atoms according to the laws of nature. That's his language. Translated into Western theistic terms, the physicist concludes, quote, hence, I am God Almighty, unquote. Despite the fact that such a phrase sounds both blasphemous and lunatic, and I'm giggling, Schrödinger believes it to be perfectly true. He turns to mystical literature, to Aldous Huxley's The Perennial Philosophy in particular, but especially to the ancient Indian Upanishads, through Huxley, I gather, and their central doctrine that Atman is Brahman, or in Schrödinger's own gloss, this is Schrödinger, the personal self equals the omnipresent, all-comprehending, eternal self, unquote. This grandest of thoughts, as he calls it, can be condensed in turn in a single Latin phrase, Deus factus sum, or I have become God. Think he is joking? Nope. Without missing a beat, Schrödinger will take up this idealist scandal again in his Turner Lectures 12 years later in 1956, which became the little book Mind and Matter. The key lecture here is entitled The Arithmetical Paradox, the Oneness of Mind. Here again, Schrödinger asserts that there is only one mind, capital M, and that it is precisely this mind that the Western religions have mistakenly identified as God, but that the Eastern religions have gotten mostly right as the eternal self. Perhaps his closest description of such a credo is a bit of ventriloquism that he performs through a 13th century Persian mystic and a German scholar of Islam translating the mystic. Here is the passage, right out of Schrödinger. On the death of any living creature, the spirit returns to the spiritual world, the body to the bodily world. In this, however, only the bodies are subject to change. The spiritual world is one single spirit who stands like unto a light behind the bodily world, and who, when any single creature comes into being, shines through it as through a window. According to the kind and size of the window, less or more light enters the world. The light itself, however, remains unchanged. The spiritual world is one single spirit. Schrödinger takes up this idealism to argue why it is foolish to ask if animals have individual souls. Of course they do not, and neither does anyone else. It's all one single spirit. He employs it again to explain what gives him so much hope when confronting the death of his friends. No one really dies, only the body does. And throughout the essay, he argues that Western science, which up to now has ignored the subjective, capital S, for an analysis of the objective, capital O, needs to be amended with a kind of blood transfusion from Eastern thought, without surrendering an iota of its logical precision. Those are all his words. For science has given us, this is him again, for science has given us a, quote, moderately satisfying picture of the world, unquote, but only, alas, at the, quote, high price of taking ourselves out of the picture, unquote. So he's quite critical of the scientific method. It is time to put us back into the picture. It is time to reintroduce the subjective into the objective, but the subjective properly understood, please note, in mystical or idealist terms, not psychological or personal ones. As with Paul Marshall above, I do not wish to argue for such a set of views here. Humorously, Schrödinger is obviously terrified of Leibniz's monads, which he calls fearful at least twice. He's scared to death of Paul. He wants to deny all real plurality for the absolute unity of mind. I am not arguing the same, as I can find multiple resonances for both models in the history of religions. Both, in fact, may well be true in different ways. I suspect so, in fact. In any case, my intentions are different. I want to point out the trans, queer, or plural possibilities of such an idealist vision. Schrödinger did not go here for sure, but we can, and rather easily so. In this metaphysics, after all, the one mind of the cosmos is inhabiting all types of bodies, really all types of species or forms of sentience. It is also evolving itself, desiring itself, having sex with itself, reproducing itself, killing itself, and eating itself, although nothing from its own trans perspective now is really being born or dying, much less being killed or eaten. The light remains utterly unchanged. As in stories about children who remember previous lives, in which small boys do things like insist that their mothers are actually their wives, I always remember a humorous American folk song in these contexts about an older man and his young son who marry a younger daughter and an older mother, respectively. Anybody know this song yet? Yeah. That is, the older man marries the much younger daughter, and the son marries the much older mother. These sexual couplings morph the subsequent family tree into a twisted bush until the son becomes his own grandfather. Hence the title of the little ditty, I Am My Own Grandpa. Well, in Schrödinger's vision, we really are. Okay. All right. In a book called Beyond Weird, the physicist and cultural commentator Philip Ball has observed that the fundamental challenge of quantum physics is its radical challenge to the human imagination, and the latter's ability, really inability, to conceive, express, and picture its own actual condition and place in a cosmos grounded and defined by quantum processes that violate almost every assumption of common sense and human reason. Calling this all weird, which is what is usually done, is not enough for Ball. Actually, it is a kind of cop-out. It is time to move beyond weird. And so Ball calls on novelists, screenwriters, and artists to reimagine ourselves after the quantum revolution, to make the unimaginable imaginable. I appreciate Ball's intentions here, but I'm a bit disturbed by how he seems to restrict such a reimagining to Western philosophy and established respectable artists. Why? Is respectability and Western rationalism really where the new imagination will come from? I doubt this very much. If we expand this cultural reception further into film, comic books, and psychedelic literature, we can quickly see that such histories are filled with attempts to do just the kind of reimagining Ball is calling for. Quantum holism, entanglement, wave-particle duality, and non-locality have all been reimagined and put to various cultural, pop cultural, and openly spiritual uses. And why not? If this is indeed how our universe works, what it is, how exactly could it be otherwise for thoughtful human beings wishing to inhabit and express the real? Hence, we get quite thoughtful reflections on how various paranormal phenomena look a great deal like quantum phenomena scaled up into human perception. Well, they do. Or we get Alex Wentz's very sophisticated suggestion that human consciousness might itself be a quantum phenomena. Again, why on earth not? The seasoned student of religion will always ask if such quantum descriptions are simply more social constructions, mere metaphors based on the languages and worldview of the 20th and now 21st century. Once we talked about the soul, now we talk about quantum consciousness. It's just another language game. This is a real question that we must meet head on. But I also think we should doubt our own doubt and entertain the possibility that there might really be something to these claims. Why? Because if comparative mystical literature means anything, it means this: do not believe what you believe. Do not think what you think. Consciousness is not culture. Consciousness is not cognition. Consciousness is not ego. Such ordinary states of mind hide, camouflage, or distract from a deeper, more fantastic reality.
There is an other world, a reality that cannot be languaged or cognized in any ordinary way. The history of science, interestingly enough, suggests the same. As Aldous Huxley observed many decades ago, one can stare at water for years or centuries and never guess that it is composed of two invisible gases bound to one another by entirely invisible forces. One must expose water to extreme and extraordinary conditions with the proper instruments to establish this fact. Something similar, Huxley pointed out, is true of human beings and the human spirit. One can stare at a human being or oneself for years or decades and never imagine that such a being is capable of entirely different states of consciousness, until, that is, such a human being is exposed to extreme or extraordinary conditions and splits apart into two. Huxley's metaphor is even more relevant today as we spend billions of dollars on the Hadron Collider, I suppose, which has already appeared in our weekend. Just the Hadron Collider now. The Hadron Collider to inflict the most exquisite, precise, and extreme violence on matter in order to fathom its otherwise completely unknowable components. This, I want to suggest, is more or less what comparative mystical literature gives us. These are flipping. I seem to have lost a slide. Those extreme or traumatic revelations of who and what we really are. Mystical literature is the Hadron Collider of human history. Accordingly, we should go there to understand the nature of consciousness as such. Okay, almost done here. Down the rabbit hole. Oddly, paradoxically, the groundwork for such a move is presently being laid in the heart of materialist science itself, in the neuroscience of perception, of all places. Enter Donald Hoffman and his book, The Case Against Reality. Hoffman argues that if Darwinian evolution is correct, there is simply no chance that what we are perceiving with our senses as an external world filled with objects is correct. His logic is a bit complex. I don't understand it all, but his essential argument is fitness beats truth. In other words, we've evolved to survive and adapt and reproduce, not to perceive reality as it really is. Hence his subtitle, Why Evolution Hid the Truth from Our Eyes. For Hoffman, all of our sensory perceptions can only constitute a kind of internal computer desktop or interface that our brains are creating to allow us to move through whatever is out there and manipulate reality's deeper software and hardware, which we never see, which we do not need to see, and which we cannot see. If I read him correctly, Hoffman suspects this more fundamental ground, what's out there, has something to do with mathematical structures that emerge from consciousness itself. It's all very Platonic, frankly. As Hoffman prefers to put the matter again, fitness beats truth. That is, our sensory capacities have evolved to allow us to survive and reproduce, not to tell us what is. Hoffman clearly recognizes that this is not a new idea. He briefly invokes Plato's cave and casually mentions different mystical traditions as precedents. But he does not seem to realize that such traditions not only claim this to be true, they claim that we can experience the deeper reality beyond and outside the computer desktop, illusion, or cave. For these historical traditions, we can really and truly know the metaphysical structures of reality itself. We can know truth with a capital T. Hoffman seems to have the problem just right then, but he seems unaware of the different historical answers to this problem, perhaps because he is still too wedded to a scientific epistemology and its objectifying method. It is not only evolution that hides the truth from us, after all, it is also science and its rigorous exclusion of the subject that hides the truth from our eyes. Schrödinger was right. There will be no future of knowledge unless we can join again the subject, capital S, to the object, capital O, which were never really separated. Still, Hoffman is fascinating and always provocative. It also seems more than a little significant that he lands on a model of mind that is very similar to Paul Marshall's, that is, one that sees our sense reality the shared world as we commonly assume it, as emerging from a vast network of underlying conscious agents and their individual experiences. His proposed model is monadological through and through. Perhaps not surprisingly again, Hoffman routinely invokes the science fiction classic The Matrix as an appropriate analog to all this. He humorously offers the red pill to 3 individuals on his dedication page, and he headlines his chapter on illusion with this epigraph: "This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill, the story ends, you wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes." Well, we're definitely in Wonderland. I was recently at a seminar at Esalen discussing this same idea, not through Hoffman, but through another author named Rizwan Virk. This, by the way, is a very common thesis these days in neuroscience, the simulation hypothesis. It's not just one guy out there. This is a whole group of people arguing this. So we were talking about Rizwan Virk and his new book, The Simulation Hypothesis. The computer scientist and ufologist, this is where the flying saucers land. The ufologist Jacques Vallée was there talking about Virk and the idea that everything we see is a kind of computer simulation, an outrageous idea made a little less so by the fact that space and time appear to be pixelated at the quantum level. Well, shit. Anyway, we were going on and on about Rizwan Virk, the Matrix this and the Matrix that, red pill, blue pill, simulation hypothesis, you know, the usual. Then we broke for lunch. We walked up the hill to the lodge where we ran into none other than Morpheus. Okay, it was the actor Lawrence Fishburne, but it was Morpheus to us. My graduate student flipped. It was all I could do to convince him not to ask Fishburne for a selfie. What do we make of such moments? Would it help if I told you that we were talking about mysterious black helicopters and UFOs the day before, and that a big helicopter hovered over the grounds at lunch, much as Morpheus appeared to us the following day? Probably not. Intellectuals commonly refuse the red pill of such stories because they are, well, absurd. They seem so sci-fi. I continue to think that this is precisely their point. If authors like Hoffman and Virk are onto something with their simulation hypothesis, and I think they are, then reality is a kind of sci-fi movie, in full color and with actual special effects, no less. Special effects that today we call paranormal. Hence the helicopter, hence Morpheus. Both appearances had perfectly natural explanations, of course. Neither was an apparition, and I suspect the helicopter was hovering over Esalen to see the naked people in the baths. But both events were also perfectly eerily timed to take on specific meanings for us. They were functioning as special effects in our shared science fiction movie. Sometimes such special effects involve the imagination in even more extraordinary ways, ways that have no easy explanation. Consider John's experience one last time. The nightmare was employing the altered states of consciousness of dream, and yet it was also a correct cognition of an all too future empirical event. How are we supposed to understand this mixing of the real and the imagined, the objective and the subjective, the future and the present, with our present banal models of the imagination? More radically still, how should we refigure the imagination if everything we sense and see is already imagined, already a kind of computer desktop or internal 3D movie? If everything we sense is imagined, then everything we sense is also a kind of art. Art does not imitate reality here, nor does reality imitate art. Reality is art. As with John's dream, I believe the textual and historical evidence for some kind of divinatory capacity of the human mind is overwhelming for anyone who chooses to spend the years necessary to examine the evidence. I also believe, and I seldom use that word, that such a divinatory capacity lies at the very root of creativity in the arts, particularly the literary ones, but I suspect in the others as well. I have looked at this looping future of the past in the corpus of the American science fiction master Philip K. Dick, who understood his own Pulp Fiction novels of the 1960s and early 70s as Gnostic gospels of a future mystical inrush that would not reveal itself until the winter of 1974. Similar time loops, however, can be found in other artists, including the American sculptor Michael Richards, who is here shown using himself as a model for his 1999 sculpture, Tar Baby versus Saint Sebastian. Here is the final sculpture. 2 years later, Richard perished in one of the Twin Towers in New York on 9/11. His studio was actually in one of the towers. There are countless examples of the same looping form of inspiration in the history of religions, of literature, of science, really of anything else that we want to look at seriously. Such evidence suggests, again, some kind of block cosmology of space-time unity, that is, some kind of universe in which the future already exists and can flow backwards in time to signal itself to a human being, often again in highly symbolic or indirect ways, as we see here. I have given yet more examples of this block time phenomena in the flip, but the anthropologist Eric Wargo has given us access to hundreds of them in his recent work on what he so elegantly calls the tesseract of the human brain and its creative time loops. Enough. I really do understand how such suggestions are highly speculative, if not wildly eccentric. Accordingly, you can hear these thoughts as attempted leaps over the 3 bars, as flips, or as flops. But you will hear them, I dare say, not as they are, but as you are. Thank you very much. Oh, and I have one slide that I just think it's funny. I think this is what the Academy on Esotericism is all about.
There's room for questions.
Is it on? Yeah. Thank you so much. That was the most fantastic talk. And I haven't quite formed the question, but once you reach a point where you have experienced so many impossible things that it's just dishonest to yourself and to those around you to go about pretending that they're not, that this is not real phenomena to you. And although you do your best to, convey the fact that it's, it's all still the cosmic joke, and don't worry, and I'm not about to have a mental breakdown, and, the rest of it. I suppose the question is, what happens when enough people have experienced enough impossibilism in their own personal experience to the furthering of the knowledge amongst those people? Like, do we have to keep pandering to those who are blinkered to that experience entirely, or can we just move on and accept this is really happening?
Yeah.
I don't know, and that's obviously from a non-academic, really.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think you can just move on as a person or a community. It's certainly not what I'm doing here. I'm really concerned about the sciences and the humanities and how they're not talking about these things. And all of the letters I get, most of them are from people who are suffering because they can't speak about it. So there are real social and psychological costs that are inflicted every day at every moment because we've repressed these things in our modern culture. So I think there are real moral and spiritual reasons to do this kind of work. But I don't think for a second that an individual or a community needs to worry what the physicists are saying or what the academics are saying. But I do think someone needs to worry about that.
And yet there's so much stigma, like you say, and
Yeah.
people do end up in institutions, and they do end up, all sorts of stuff happens because, talking about these kind of experiences, a lot of people have said to me, I'm so glad you talk about your mental health. And I feel like, that's not really what I feel I'm talking about here. But it keeps the question, it keeps it open. And
I think, we're going back to the academic thing. I think academics do possess some kind of authority in the culture. And so I think it's really important that they just stand up and talk about these things openly and blatantly. And when they do, what happens is people feel authorized. People feel empowered to step into that conversation. And then, the clearing in the forest gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And
we need a Me Too of impossibilism.
yeah.
Thanks, that was fab. Just kind of leading on from what Daisy said, and also if reality is art and all kinds of weird stuff happens on an individual level, I'm wondering what we're creating on a collective level. I'm maybe not talking about, maybe I'm talking about, well, the theme of our conference here is ecological collapse in some sense, or ecological, what's the theme of our conference? Yeah, so to look at that and think, okay, well, reality is art, and collectively look what the fuck we're creating. And also coming back to a question earlier about the authority of the academy and the authority of the magicians, let's say.
The physicist, or the magician, okay.
Well, I was going to say, you have 20,000 academics have now signed a paper warning about climate catastrophe and no particular policy change, So if we're creating that reality, that art, what can magicians do who aren't bound by not doing what's impossible? How can we up our game, basically, to make better art on a collective level rather than on an individual level?
Yeah, I think, again, great question. The version of that I usually get asked is, how do we start another counterculture, or how do we start another religion, essentially? And the model that's being presented here is not solipsistic, it's not individual. The reality emerges from countless forms of experience and subjectivity. So this is why social action or political action is so relevant. You can't actually change the art of reality individually. You might change it for yourself, but it's not going to change for everybody else. So this model that people like Paul and Donald Hoffman are really speculating about really assumes some kind of deep collectivity that needs to be engaged. And the most honest answer to you is I don't know. I'm not an artist in that sense. I think we all have to work in our zones and in our communities the best we can, but I just can't tell you how to do your art. I just don't know. I'm a terrible religious leader too, by the way.
I'll just want to bring in someone. There's a guy called Kalindi who comes a lot to the psychedelic conferences, and the gist of what he'll say often at the end of a conference where people have been talking about what psychedelics do to the receptors and blah blah blah. He'll get up. He's kind of like the Mr. T of the psychedelic community and say, "We've got to increase the doses, man," right? And he's advocating massive mushroom trips. And I'm just wondering if we might advocate like serious magic.
Let me pick up on the psychedelic thread. I wrote this book Wouter mentioned about Esalen, which is very much about the American counterculture and the psychedelic scene. And there was a debate early in the counterculture between Aldous Huxley and Tim Leary. And the debate was basic. Leary thought that. Let's up the dosage, man. Let's put it in the Kool-Aid and the tea and everything else, and let's trip everybody, and the world will change. That was not Huxley's position. Huxley basically said, for Christ's sake, Tim, shut up. What's going to happen is they're going to come after us. They're going to throw us in jail. They're going to make this illegal. He says, no, we have to use this stuff, but we have to use it, really carefully and in small groups and do it right. So that's, and some people will argue, well, Leary, you wouldn't have had a counterculture without Leary's solution. So maybe he was right. Other people would say the psychedelic renaissance going on today is very much in Huxley's line. It is not the Timothy Leary approach. It's the Aldous Huxley approach. So I think there's a debate there, about how to affect change. Yeah, Petra. I think would they want a mic on you?
So, I heard a lot about art this weekend, and just now, art is magic, art is reality, art is revelation, revelation is trauma. What is art is, I guess, my question now. I'm kind of having a hard time, and then a second question, for me, art is a lot of things, but I find value in its ability, like you're saying, to sort of bypass the sort of a subjective, objective conversation, and hopefully have some sort of direct connection. And then I wonder what you think, if this sort of meta layer approach to looking at art, and subjective, objective, and trying to contextualize everything could in some ways inhibit direct connection.
So, Petra, I really don't know the question. Are you asking me what art is?
Yes.
That's pretty big.
It's been used so much this weekend in so many different directions, and it's being attributed so much,
Yeah, I guess I'm more comfortable asking the question, what is art in relationship to religion? And I like to say religion is art that's forgotten its art. It takes itself literally or more dogmatically, and it becomes this stable institution that can last over many, many generations. But you constantly have these artists who are producing new forms of proto-religion, new worldviews, and most of them don't stick, but some of them do. And I'll just tell you another thing. Years ago, I was telling Wouter this earlier, I took a pilgrimage really to Rome. I'd never been to Rome. I grew up Roman Catholic, and so Rome was really important to me. And Rome shocked me. I was so blown away by the Renaissance artists because of what they got away with. If you haven't been to Rome, you should go to Rome. The stuff they put on the walls and the ceilings of churches is just extraordinary. And so I think that is the role of the artist, to sort of push the envelope and get away with a lot of stuff that other people can't get away with. It's sort of like the comedian in American culture today. The comedian's really kind of our truth teller. And there aren't a lot of other places in the culture where people are telling the truth.
As somebody who obviously studies religion, listening to what you're saying, and this is probably very simplistic because I don't have a science background at all, there's an awful lot of what you're saying that, to my mind, is stuff that religions have been talking about for years, like the idea that the material reality is not the only reality. What was the other one that's going to disappear from my mind right now? That always happens, doesn't it, when you've got the mic in your hand? Anyway, there were 3 or 4 things that I was listening to you going, yeah, that's what religions have always said. So do you, I'm not exactly sure what my question is, do you feel a level of frustration that some of the more archaic understandings of knowledge, we're having to go over old ground again, or not? And how do you perceive that conversation moving forward?
So the book is about scientists and medical professionals and people like that. And what fascinates me about these individuals is they have such a tremendous authority in our culture. And so when they flip, it matters, in a way that it doesn't matter if someone else flips. And they often reproduce what you're correctly describing as ancient religious structures, and they don't know it all the time. Sometimes they recognize that, sometimes they don't. And so I just find it fascinating that you can find the same kinds of experiences and convictions in what were essentially materialist-oriented scientists in the modern world that you can find in the pre-modern world. And they're sort of doing that in a way that is often naive or not knowing, but they're still doing it. And so these ideas seem to be much more stable and much more recurring than we imagine. And I also find it fascinating that it's happening in the heart of the sciences. This is not a tangential thing. I mean, the more you read, you'll say, so nobody understands quantum physics, okay. But the point is that quantum physicists have been writing books to try to explain what it is for us for a century now. And so it's obviously important. And we obviously should be thinking about it. And we should be trying to imagine it. And it's okay if we don't know the math. That's not the point. So I think this is just a really important conversation about what reality is and how things are shifting.
Thank you.
Right. How would you say that the perspective you're proposing here, how would you wish that it would change the way us historians of religion are studying religions?
Yeah. I knew you were going to ask that. I've written so much about that pair. I'm not complaining. I'm obsessed with that question. I was trained in the history of religions like you, but in a different kind of sort of lineage of thought that's much more open to sort of metaphysical questions. And I'm very aware that a lot of the field is very secular or atheistic, as you put it earlier. But I do think if you look at the history of religions, you look at the discipline and you look at the main figures, these themes come up again and again and again. And there's kind of this undercurrent in our discipline, in our history, that people are in the closet on this. But this is exactly why they're studying what they're studying. And so I think it's a deep part of who we are as a discipline as well. And I've tried to argue that. And I hope it does change how we think of the history of religions and how we train our graduate students. I mean, we're certainly trying to change that at Rice. We're doing it differently. We're training them differently than I was trained at Chicago, or certainly the generations before me were trained at the same institution. So, I mean, the discipline is ours. It's whatever the hell we say it is. I mean, I think we have to own our authority and honor our ancestors, but also, we're not that anymore. We're at a different place and we're saying different things.
Who is enforcing the status quo? Who are the agents of the matrix that are holding back the cognitive revolution?
It's a great question. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, so I don't think there's some committee somewhere or some Illuminati or anybody else. I think the pressures are largely social and professional. One of the stories I wanted to open with was, I have a colleague, he happens to be a parapsychologist, and he held a large conference on psi and the sciences years ago in Canada. And he said he got all kinds of major scientists came to it, but not a single one would come without a promise of anonymity. So this goes back to the secrecy question we were talking about in the academy. There are real rules, in the academy about what you can say and what you can't say, but it depends on your discipline. It depends on your location in this imaginary totem pole. The physicists are up here, so they actually can say almost nothing until they retire. Where the study of religion, we're actually not just at the bottom, we're under the ground. And so we can, some of us anyway, can say anything because we don't have any status in that hierarchy of knowledge. So I think there is a politics or sociology of knowledge. I think it's different in the US than it is in Europe, frankly. It's different depending on if you're a state school or a private school. I mean, there's all kinds of, it's a very local kind of thing, but I think it's very real, and I think it really does clamp down on these kinds of discussions. So I don't think nobody's responsible, but in some sense everybody's responsible.
Well, I see, Kevin, that it's time to start wrapping up, unless there's a very urgent question, but I don't think so. So I think we have to just thank Jeff very much for this
Thank you.
lecture and everything.